Good morning. I hope you're all doing great and you're surviving this Arctic blast that we've been having. It's actually gotten up to a little bit above freezing here today. Without much else going on, my wife and I have been watching Apple TV and Netflix and stuff like that. And last night we watched a great movie called Greyhound. It's this movie with Tom Hanks where he's the commander of a light destroyer during World War II. And his first mission is to protect a convoy of merchant ships from the United States over to England. And I don't know who came up with this idea of the Black Pit. You can imagine the captain saying, "Nothing to fear, men, we're about to enter the Black Pit." The Black Pit was a region in the middle of the Atlantic where aircraft could no longer protect the convoys. It was 3 days to get across the Black Pit. Soon after entering the Black Pit, they encountered their first German U-boat, which they were able to successfully defend themselves against. And then as they're about to enter nightfall on their first day in the Black Pit, they realize that there's a pack of German U-boats shadowing them just out of range, waiting until nightfall to attack because then the convoy won't be able to spot them. From then until the end of the film, these ships are plowing through the gray waters of the North Atlantic in these storms, and night falls and you've got these German U-boats hunting them at night. It's one of these movies that once you start it, you're not going to stop it for any reason until you get to the very end. And that's all I'm going to tell you because I don't want to spoil the ending of the film for you. Okay, let's head on down and take a look at our study in narratives. And we're picking up looking at setting and tone today. Sit, shake, yeah. Good girl. All right, I got to work now, okay? You're watching the Caffeinated Bible. My name is David Paris, and the goal of this channel is to help you read your Bible in a more thoughtful, engaged, and productive manner. Today we're continuing our study in narrative because narrative is perhaps our fundamental form of thought, and almost all of our rational abilities depend on it. It's our primary way of remembering the past, explaining something to others in the present, and thinking about the future or imagining possibilities. For this reason, narratives within the Bible are incredibly important. Now, so far we've looked at the importance of narratives, characters, plot and plot structure, doing a plot diagram, and then authors, narrators, and readers. Today, I want to take a look at setting. When we're looking at the setting of a biblical story, we need to ask the question, is this included just to move the story along, or does it play a pivotal role in the text? Not only does setting provide the location for the story where it takes place, but often it's significant in itself. Events that take place in the temple are often loaded with theological connotations and context. What does setting do? Setting initiates the mood, time, location of a story. Setting usually tells us where the story takes place. Is it outside, in the desert, on a mountain, on a lake? And the geographical setting conveys a lot of information as well. Is this an isolated area, an urban setting? Is it dangerous or is it safe? What about the weather, the time of the day? For example, Jesus traveling across the Sea of Galilee by boat creates a very specific type of setting. But when he is asleep in the boat while they're in the middle of the lake and suddenly a very powerful storm comes up, this is a very different type of setting. Even though geographically the two settings of these two different stories were probably no more than a couple miles apart at most. Setting also conveys the social and cultural information behind the story. When Jesus is in Galilee, he's in a small rural village situation. When he goes up to Jerusalem, he's moving into a large urban area that is also the seat of the Jewish religion and where the officials reside and the temple is located. Setting also conveys a great deal of biblical information. When Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, we know that he's in an isolated and fairly hostile geographic location. But it also has allusions back to Israel's wandering in the wilderness for 40 days in the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. When Elijah is on Mount Carmel, we know that there's an abandoned altar to Yahweh there. So the location on Mount Carmel alludes to Elijah's ministry of restoring Israel's faith, just as he's going to rebuild that altar. Mount Carmel was also the site for the worship of Baal, the rain god of the Canaanites, because of its prominence along the coast. It was a natural feature that caused more precipitation to occur on the mountain there. So when stories occur within Israel, we need to be especially aware of the religious history and previous stories associated with that location that this story might be making allusions to. Another aspect of setting that we need to be aware of is that it's personal space also. In Mark chapter 2, the story of the paralytic, this story opens with Jesus being at home. This creates a very different type of setting for the story than if Mark told us that he was in a synagogue or in the marketplace for Capernaum or out on the countryside. It conveys a very safe, warm, welcoming location for where Jesus and his ministry is taking place in Mark chapter 2. And a final form of setting that's important in the Bible is what I'm going to call alternate realities. A great example of this is the book of Revelation. The apocalyptic visions that John gives in the book of Revelation are not meant to be understood in a way similar to what we say, for example, the stories in the book of Acts. John instead presents us with visions of the future and visions of heaven above. It's filled with cataclysmic battles between good and evil, beasts that rise up out of the sea, dragons, Jesus riding on a white horse into battle with a sword coming out of his mouth, 144,000 martyrs underneath this altar crying out during a worship service. It's filled with visions of all things wild and wonderful. And the setting is very different than a story, for example, that we would see in the book of Acts or the Gospels. Now, the term alternate realities is not meant to convey any sort of idea that these are fantasy or science fiction type texts. Rather, I'm just trying to come up with a term that covers a wide range of texts, from Revelation to Ezekiel, something that covers all these sort of prophetic and alternate type visions of what reality is all about. So the question is the setting mentioned just to move the story along, just as a place where something has to occur? Or is the setting playing a more complex role in the story? That is it bringing complexity to the story than just providing a location for the story to unfold? Setting also conveys what's called tone or mood, and this is the emotional stance by which we relate to the narrative. Is this story taking place in a safe setting? Is it full of conflict and danger? This is much more of an intangible feel to the story. If you can think back on a horror movie for a second, this will give you an idea of what tone or mood is all about. Or the movie Greyhound that I was talking about in the beginning of the video. Having these scenes shot at night where they can barely see anything with the North Atlantic waves, the sailors on the ship not being able to spot where the U-boats are. That movie really conveys a tone of suspense. It really grabs you. So let's take a look at the parable of the prodigal son and see how the setting contributes to how we understand the parable and how it changes the way we move through the text. Here's what I would suggest. Pause the video right now and go to Luke chapter 15 and take a look at the parable of the prodigal son. And underline or make notes of all the references to setting in that parable that you notice and what you think that is conveying to you. Then once you've done that, resume this video and we're going to take a look at the parable of the prodigal son together in Luke chapter 15.
A few minutes later.
Now this parable opens with an introductory statement in verses 1 and 2. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming to him, but the Pharisees and the experts in the law were complaining, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Notice that we're not given a geographical location here, but it's implied that this is some sort of public area as tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, and scribes are all able to gather at that place. And also, it's implied that there is food and drinking taking place. The mention of tax collectors and sinners creates a tone that these are unclean people, maybe a little bit on the wild side of the fringes of society. This contrasts with the other two groups, the Pharisees and the scribes, who would have been highly respected and at the center of their culture. This then introduces a tension into the mood, perhaps that of conflict. Now I'm going to skip over the parables of the lost coin and the lost sheep and go straight to the parable of the lost son for the sake of time. So we're going to jump down to verse 11. In verse 11, Jesus starts the parable of the prodigal son, and he says, "A man had two sons." Immediately applied here is the setting of a family or a home situation. That should be a good situation. But oftentimes in the Old Testament stories, there's a number of family structures that have a fractured family relationship. Jacob being thrown into the well by his brothers, Cain murdering Abel come to mind. But in this story, it seems like the symbolic setting or allusions to the Old Testament are really not front and center here. It really seems to be focusing on this father with two sons. In verses 12 and 13, the younger son said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the estate that will belong to me." So he divided his estate between them, and a few days later, the younger son gathered everything that he had and went on a journey to a distant country. And there he squandered his wealth with a wild lifestyle. By verse 12, we've got a huge shift in the setting of the story. And there's a number of the aspects of the setting that I want to pull out in these two verses. First off is that the son left on a journey to a distant country. This creates a huge shift in the setting. He is now no longer at home, and the distance here is not just physical, but also emotional. He is now separated from his family. He is distant from them. We also get a picture of what the setting and his lifestyle was like. It was a wild lifestyle. The Greek word for wild is asotos, and it brings across the idea of madness that knows no bounds, total wastefulness. When our kids were about 7 or 8 years old, we were vacationing with friends of ours up in Leadville, Colorado. This is truly an old mining town. Now, I don't know what happened to the other 3 adults and what they decided, but somehow I was delegated as the responsible one to care for the 5 kids between our 2 families for the afternoon. Well, I just happened to know this old historic saloon in Leadville that served locally made organic root beer. So me and the 5 junior members of my party all sidled up to the bar, and I paid for root beers all around. While we're sitting at the bar, one of our friend's daughters asked the bartender, "Is this a real bar?" To which he replied, "Yes, sirree." The other daughter, who was a little bit younger, jumped in, "No, it isn't." He put down his bar towel and looked at her straight in the eye, and he said, "What makes you think it isn't?" And she said, "Because there aren't any people standing around laughing real loud and slapping each other on the back." I'm not sure what her parents had her watch, but this idea that a bar had to be filled with people laughing out loud and slapping each other on the back was her definition of bar, and it constituted the setting for what a bar was. I think this is a good way to envision the setting of this son being engaged in a wild lifestyle. Verses 14 through 16. Then, after he had spent everything, a severe famine took place in that country, and he began to be in need. And he went and he worked for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed his pigs. And he was longing to eat the carob pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. The severe famine here creates another major shift in the setting, from wild living to famine. Then we have this movement from what is implied from an urban setting to rural, from civilized life to living with animals. And not just with any animals. He's caring for pigs, which carries a very unclean connotation from a Jewish perspective. Verse 17. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired workers have food enough to spare, but here I am dying of hunger?" Now this verse presents an alternate reality. It's an alternate reality scene being depicted. He is imagining what life would be like back at his father's house. Verse 20. So he got up and went back to his father. But while he was still a long way off from his home, his father saw him, and his heart went out to him, and he ran and hugged his son and kissed him. In this verse, we actually have the shift in setting being depicted for us. The son, who was emotionally and geographically separated from his family, is traveling back home, and he's closing that geographical and emotional distance that he created at the start of the story. I think this sets a tone of longing on the younger son's part. He's almost home. What will the reception be? Will he be spared from starvation? When Luke includes that the father saw him, it also brings across this idea of longing on the father's part. Has he been watching, waiting, or is this just a chance sighting of this boy at a distance? In verses 21 through 24, we see the father's actions. He gets the ring, the sand on the robe. He has the fattened calf killed. The setting is one of celebration, rejoicing, and a party. A lot like the wild living in that foreign land, but this time it's not wild madness, but proper celebration. But the parable doesn't end there. Verse 25. Now the older son was in the field, and as he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. Now we have the older son, and he too is approaching the house like the younger son. But while he's still out in the field, he hears music and dancing coming from the house. The setting here lets us know that the older son is not in the house where the father is. And the sounds that he hears there should remind us of the wild living that the younger son has been involved in that distant country. Verses 26 and 27. So he called one of the slaves and asked what was happening. The slave replied, "Your brother has returned, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he got his son back safe and sound." Now this explains the setting of the son's return to the older son. And it also lets us know that the celebration in the house is completely appropriate. It is not wild madness. Verse 28. But the older son became angry and refused to go in. And his father came out and appealed to him. Again, the setting shifts here. The older son refused to go in. Not just that, but he's stewing out there in the field. And the father goes out to him as well, just like he went out to the younger son. But this time the tone is one of conflict. The older son is having an emotional meltdown out there in the fields. This brings us to 29 through 30. But he answered his father, "Look, these many years I have worked like a slave for you. I have never disobeyed your commands, yet you never gave me even a goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." When the older son describes his setting here, we learn a number of things. First, he has been geographically near the father, but he has been emotionally distant from him. Second, he views his setting or position in the house there as a slave, not as a son. This is the same position that the younger son was hoping he could receive when he returned home. Remember, he said, "Make me one of your servants." Verses 31 through 32. Then the father said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and everything that I have belongs to you. It was appropriate to celebrate and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." Finally, we get the father's perspective on the setting. First, he has always been with this older son. Second, he does not view the setting as one of a master-slave relationship, but as a family. All that the father has was the older son's. Third, what is happening in the house is appropriate because life has been restored and what was lost has been found. So we see as we just walk through the parable of the prodigal son and just look for aspects that mention setting, and we think about them a little bit, how much that conveys the meaning of the parable itself. Setting can carry an incredible amount of cognitive freight with it, and we need to watch for it as we go through stories. Oh, and I forgot something. I'll be right back. I just wanted to let you know that I am giving away a copy of this book, Living Parables. You might have a chance to enter a comment underneath this one. Saturday the 19th, I will announce who wins this book. I'll just post a short video up concerning the book, and so you can take a look at that and see who wins a copy. And then I'll have instructions on how to get hold of me so I can mail this to you. Once again, I hope you're all doing great. It really looks like we've got hope for getting out from underneath this pandemic of the COVID virus. But then, right on top of that, we get this huge Arctic vortex that comes through. I will catch you next week, and until then, may the peace of the Lord be with you.